Hello and welcome to today's ICMA University Web Conference, Promoting Solar Energy Use Through Local Development Regulations. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Erin Musial, AICP, Senior Program Development and Research Associate for the American Planning Association. Erin, if you're ready, it is all yours.
Thanks, Amelia. As Amelia just said, my name is Erin Musial, and I'm a Senior Program Development and Research Associate with the American Planning Association in our D.C. office. Welcome to today's webinar, Promoting Solar Energy Use Through Local Development Regulations, which is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Energy's Sunshot Solar Outreach Partnership. The Solar Outreach Partnership, or SolarOps for short, is a DOE initiative designed to increase the use and integration of solar energy in communities nationwide. The partnership's activities include outreach, educational programs and materials, and technical assistance. You can learn more about the partnership and its activities by visiting the SolarOps website at solaroutreach.org. This is the third webinar in a three-part series on the theme of promoting solar energy use through local planning. The series is rooted in a recent set of American Planning Association briefing papers, which are available at the web address shown on screen, along with a number of other APA resources related to planning for solar. The first webinar of the series explained why it's important for communities to plan for solar energy use and offered guidance to planners, public officials, and solar advocates to help them initiate and facilitate conversations about solar in their communities. The second webinar in the series addressed how to promote solar energy use through local plans. Today we will talk about promoting solar energy use through local development regulations. Once you have engaged your community in a conversation about solar energy use and integrated solar energy goals and policies into your comprehensive plan, it's important to set the stage for implementation by addressing solar energy in the zoning ordinance. Today, we'll examine why it's important to address solar energy use in local development regulations and talk about the basic type of provisions communities should consider, as well as some new trends in solar and up-and-coming types of solar provisions. The last part of the program is devoted to your questions. Throughout the webinar, you can submit your questions by clicking on Q&A in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. Just type the question in and select Ask, and we'll do our best to provide as many answers as possible at the end of the program. Joining me today are two planners who will discuss these issues. It's my pleasure to introduce Ann Dillamuth and Darcy White. Ann is a research associate with the American Planning Association in our Chicago office and part of APA's Solar Ops project team. Welcome, Ann.
Thanks, Erin.
Darcy is director in the Denver, Colorado office of Clarion Associates, where she works in many aspects of planning, including comprehensive planning for small and mid-sized communities, sustainable community plans, development codes, and solar energy issues. Welcome, Darcy.
Thanks, Erin.
And let's get started with a question for you. Why is it important that communities address solar energy specifically in local development regulations?
Well, that's a good question, Erin, and there's a pretty straightforward answer. One of the keys to implementing solar energy goals in a community is having a supportive regulatory environment, and a big part of that is simply having solar policies and standards in place. So at a basic level, it's important that communities add standards for solar energy to their local development regulations so that they are prepared when homeowners or business owners want to install solar energy systems on their properties. The same is also true for large-scale commercial solar installations. We're seeing more and more of these springing up across the country, so local governments will want to have clear standards in place before they are faced with a development application for a solar farm. In addition, there's a number of benefits that result when communities add solar energy provisions to their development codes. So having clear standards for where and when both small and large solar energy facilities are permitted eliminates uncertainty for homeowners and developers. Standards are also important to ensure that solar facilities are placed in appropriate locations and meet basic safety standards, and also that they won't be a nuisance for adjacent homeowners. Having clear regulatory provisions can also help mitigate potential conflicts between solar energy and other community values, such as tree preservation, historic preservation, or urban redevelopment. Clear standards provide guidance for how to respond in situations where there is conflict, and they can also help development occur in ways that reduce the possibilities of problems down the road. Provisions like solar easements and solar access standards are important to adopt to help preserve property owners' access to the solar resource and also help them protect their investments in solar energy systems. Solar siting standards can help shape new development in ways that will maximize the possible use of solar energy, both passive and active. And then finally, solar-ready home provisions can help ensure that new development is solar energy friendly, which makes it much easier for owners to install solar energy systems in the future.
Thanks, Anne. And Darcy, what are some of the other issues communities should think about when adding solar regulations to their codes?
Well, Erin, removing barriers to solar energy systems is also important. Unless communities are proactive about identifying and removing potential barriers to solar in their development regulations, these issues often aren't discovered until you've got a solar application that's already in the pipeline, and as we all know, that can be problematic. This can result in some last-minute scrambling on the part of local planners and can also increase the potential delay for applicants. So let's walk through some of those typical barriers you might see to consider. Private covenants that prohibit or severely restrict solar are a common barrier in some parts of the country. Although covenants are not directly within public control, planners can educate about state limits on restrictions. Solar laws exist in 38 states to prevent such restrictions and authorize incentives, but many people are unaware of their rights. State laws vary in their breadth and specificity, so it's always wise to get familiar with applicable laws in your community before you start the process of developing new regulations. For example, local governments in Nevada may not prohibit or unreasonably restrict solar and wind energy facilities, meaning they significantly decrease their efficiency or result in increased costs for those facilities. In Connecticut and California, local authority over energy facilities in historic districts is specifically addressed. Again, important to consider what's applicable in your local community. Historic district regulations have also typically limited where solar energy systems could be placed due to aesthetic concerns. However, many communities are starting to allow for increased flexibility in this regard. For example, stating a preferred location for solar that's not visible from the street, but allowing for alternative siting if the preferred location would reduce the viability of the system. For example, the City of San Antonio recently adopted new historic district guidelines and addressed the issue of solar and energy efficiency specifically for both the rehabilitation of historic structures as well as for infill development within a historic district. Nationally, we're also seeing recognition of this shift. The Secretary of the Interior recently released a set of guidelines that address the integration of sustainable development features, such as solar, during the rehabilitation of historic buildings. This document is available online as a very good resource on this topic. Other potential barriers include dimensional standards within your code that may restrict optimal panel placement, such as height restrictions, lot coverage limitations, or setback requirements. Providing some built-in flexibility in your community's development regulations to address potential siting issues is a simple way to remove this barrier. For example, some communities allow installations within setbacks if they are less than a certain height, or allow solar energy systems to exceed maximum height limits in order to allow for their efficient operation. Incentives are also an important part of the picture and typically fall within one of three categories: streamlined approval processes, reduce permitting costs, or increased flexibility in exchange for the incorporation of solar or other sustainable development features. The first category is streamlined approval processes. These efforts are geared towards making it as quick and easy as possible to get a solar application through the approval process. For some, this means simply making solar applications and regulations readily accessible to applicants, providing a detailed checklist of what needs to be submitted and when, while others may go so far as to appoint a solar ombudsman to help applicants through the approval process. There are a number of examples of communities who have taken steps to streamline their processes for solar. San Jose or Sacramento, California are just two examples of successful models to take a look at. Second, some communities are reducing permitting costs. Although it has become less common in recent years to budget constraints that many communities have faced, some communities do elect to reduce or waive permit fees paid by applicants for qualifying solar installations. And really, this is just designed to help offset the cost of equipment and installation. Lastly, incentives can be built into development regulations by providing increased flexibility in exchange for solar or other sustainable development features. This approach is most effective in an area where you're able to offer something in return for that flexibility. For example, increased density or building height in exchange for solar or other sustainable features. This might work well in a downtown area or within a transit-oriented development area where you're looking to increase the overall intensity of development.
Thanks, Darcy. Anne, now that we know why it's important for communities to address solar energy in their development codes, what types of provisions should they consider?
Well, there's a number of different types of solar ordinance provisions that communities should be thinking about, and I've listed here the main ones we'll be talking about today. So first is the most common, regulations for solar energy systems, both for smaller scale accessory uses, like solar panels on a roof of a house, and also for primary use systems, such as utility scale solar farms. Less important, or less common, but also important, are solar easements and solar access laws. These are the regulations that protect access to sunlight for solar energy systems. Communities can also adopt provisions for solar site design that encourage development patterns allowing optimal use of solar energy. And then finally, there are solar-ready home regulations that require pre-wiring and plumbing to allow for easy future additions of solar systems to buildings.
Let's start with what's most familiar to most people, development standards for solar energy systems. And what should the zoning ordinance cover?
Well, the good thing about accessory use solar energy systems, especially rooftop systems, is that their land use impacts are fairly minimal. So as a result, it's becoming fairly common for communities to permit accessory solar systems by right in all districts. This can be done in a couple of ways. Communities can add solar energy systems to the list of permitted accessory uses for each zoning district, or a lot of communities choose to create a standalone section for solar energy systems that basically says this use is permitted in all districts. The main concerns with accessory systems tend to be aesthetic. Darcy mentioned this earlier. So that's where and how they are placed on a property. Many communities decide to add specific requirements to their codes. These can include panel placement, probably the most common, where on the property you can mount the panels. Some communities encourage panel placement on parts of the roof not visible to the public right-of-way. Pretty much standard in historic districts, but most communities do choose to do this. For ground-mounted systems, it's fairly common to limit their placement to side or rear yards, and some communities even require screening from public rights-of-way. Height can also be an issue. Most panels are installed to lie flat on a rooftop, but in some cases they may be installed at an angle to better catch the most sun. Some communities do limit the height of rooftop panels to, for example, 3 feet above the roof line. But because this can be a barrier, as Darcy also mentioned earlier, a lot of communities exempt solar panels from district height regulations, along with other rooftop structures like chimneys, air conditioning units, or steeples. System appearance can also be addressed. Some communities require neutral paint colors for non-panel components and also screening. And then finally, most ordinances address permitting and code requirements. For safety reasons, many communities require that systems be commercially made and professionally installed by licensed solar installers. A building permit is often required, and along with that, plans for the design of the system and then technical and electrical specifics. Some communities also look at structural issues just to make sure that the roof can handle the installation of the solar panels. So for primary use solar systems, like solar farms, these are a lot larger and they have more potential land use impacts. So it makes sense for communities to be more careful in how they regulate these uses. Many communities limit the location of these uses to rural, industrial, or certain commercial zoning districts, and they typically require conditional or special use approvals. Development standards may address height limitations, setbacks from property lines, and screening from public rights-of-way. Because solar farms are basically power plants, safety and security are important issues, and communities may require fencing, warning signs, and undergrounding of electrical interconnections and power lines. Application requirements usually include a detailed site plan and also may take larger issues into consideration, such as stormwater management or erosion control, or something like potential impacts on wildlife. And finally, most local ordinances, similar to wind energy ordinances, include a decommissioning clause, which requires the removal of the solar equipment if the solar farm is shut down. So one example we can look at is the Solar Power Plants Ordinance from Iron County, Utah. They have fairly extensive primary use solar provisions. The ordinance defines two types of permitted solar power plants, PV plants and concentrated thermal plants. It then lists out a number of regulations and design standards. Solar power plants are conditional uses in agricultural and industrial districts. They're also allowed as conditional uses in commercial and light industrial districts in conjunction with other development of the site. The ordinance sets out a minimum lot size of 5 acres for PV solar farms and 40 acres for concentrated solar thermal power plants. It allows structural heights of at least 30 feet and also requires a 100-foot setback from all residential lots and structures, along with additional setbacks that may be required in order to mitigate specific impacts. For safety, a locked fence must surround the site and include appropriate warning signage. And the ordinance addresses noise as well. It limits noise generation to 45 dBA at neighboring residences between 9 p.m. and 7 a.m., and then has a 60 dBA limit at property lines the rest of the time. It addresses visual impacts as well. It requires harmonious colors for system components, appropriate screening, dark sky compliant lighting, and it also prohibits glare. The ordinance requires electrical interconnections and distribution lines to be underground and fully code compliant. And then the ordinance also requires defensible space for fire protection, which is important in the West. So to supplement the standard conditional use review process, this ordinance also provides 14 additional criteria for conditional use review. These are the project rationale, and this includes the markets for the energy, siting considerations. They list things like avoiding environmentally sensitive locations, scenic corridors, cultural resources, and areas of erosion risk. They ask for site and development plans that detail the proposed solar installation, including grading and revegetation plans for the site. The county requires an analysis of local economic benefits, including project cost, taxes generated, and number of local construction and permanent jobs. They ask for a visual impacts analysis of project components, which might include mirrors, towers, electrical lines, access roads, and utility installations. They look at wildlife habitat areas and migration patterns, and they require an environmental analysis if a state or federal one has not already been required. They look at solid or hazardous waste issues, look for plans that address spill prevention, cleanup, and disposal. They also include an FAA review for any compliance with air navigation restrictions that might comply. Again, similar to wind farm regulations, they require a transportation plan for construction and operation phases. So this would look at any new roads that would need to be constructed, which existing roads will be used, and this is to ensure that any roadways or infrastructure that might be damaged during construction is restored to appropriate conditions. They also ask for a public safety analysis, a noise analysis, and then finally a decommissioning plan to address reclamation of the land if the project is ended or abandoned. And this also includes revegetation and road repair. So that's a pretty comprehensive list of all of the things that a community might want to consider in reviewing a solar farm proposal.
Great. Now let's move on to regulations that protect sunlight. Darcy, can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. Well, much of what we've talked about today deals with ways in which you can ensure solar can be accommodated in your community. We've yet to touch on ways to protect that investment once it is made. Protecting solar access can be achieved in several ways. One is by permitting or requiring solar easements. Solar easements are legal agreements for a particular property designed to protect solar access. They're typically voluntary, enacted by property owners with a desire to protect solar access for the purposes of maintaining the viability of either an existing system that they have installed or in anticipation of a system they may want to install down the road. Solar easements generally address the specific property or portions of a property to which the easement applies and establish limitations on building height or potential obstructions such as trees and other vegetation. While solar easements are less common, they're important to consider as part of an overall strategy. While solar access ordinances are less common, they are important to consider as part of an overall strategy. Communities choose to address the issue of solar access more broadly through solar access ordinances. These ordinances establish provisions to protect solar access by limiting the amount of shade that can be cast on an adjoining property at a particular time of day and month of the year. Some solar access ordinances are very prescriptive and others are more flexible. So let's look at a couple of examples. One of the more rigorous approaches to regulating solar access is to define a solar fence that is applied to individual lots and is used to help define the bulk and mass of new structures. As indicated in this example, this approach can be tailored to address variations in the built form of different parts of the community, varied topography, or other considerations that may vary at the local level. One of the benefits of this approach is that if applied consistently, it can lead to a more predictable and quantifiable outcome for applicants. However, it is also going to be more challenging to administer. It requires a lot of detailed review and a clear knowledge of the application of the provisions. Because solar access ordinances can be more challenging to administer, many communities choose to address the issue of solar access more generally in their development regulations. In this example, protection of solar access is required, but it's not quantified in any way. The provision to note here, or the statement to note, is that elements of the development plan shall be located and designed to the maximum extent feasible, implying that there is some flexibility there, but this is something that the community would really like you to try to accomplish. So a more flexible approach to consider.
Once access to sunlight is protected, Darcy, what can communities do to make sure that new development can actually use that solar resource?
So thinking long term, some communities actually require new developments to orient streets, lots, and in some cases individual buildings to maximize solar access. While solar energy systems may not be installed at the time of development, the strategy ensures that should a homeowner or property owner choose to install a solar energy system in the future, that the orientation of their home or lot will maximize the productivity of that system. This type of requirement most typically applies to greenfield development. However, there are a few examples out there that have been modified to fit within an infill context as well.
Great. And what's left on the list for communities to think about?
Well, besides the land use and site design provisions we've just described, planners can also advocate for amendments to local building codes for solar-ready homes. These provisions, as we mentioned earlier, require new construction to include electrical wiring as well as plumbing to support the later installation of both solar PV and hot water systems. So communities can do this in a couple of ways. It can be mandatory. cities like Chula Vista in California and Tucson have amended their building codes to require solar readiness in new construction. Another way to address this in the code is voluntarily, for example, through a green building program. You can add solar readiness as an option or feature that earns green credits. Henderson, Nevada is one city that has taken this approach.
That's a pretty comprehensive look at the most common types of regulations that communities are adding to implement solar. Darcy, are there any new trends or regulatory areas that you and Ann haven't discussed yet?
Yes, Erin, there's a couple of emerging trends that we're seeing that we wanted to touch on. First, the number of community solar gardens has dramatically increased across the country over the past year or so, particularly in some of the western states. In general terms, community solar gardens are a shared solar array that serves a group of individuals or businesses. In terms of potential regulatory impacts, perhaps the biggest issue for communities to consider is where they should be allowed by right versus with conditions. Ann touched on this topic a little bit with respect to larger solar installations. What we're seeing primarily is that most communities today are allowing them by right only in non-residential districts. However, consideration should be given to the types of standards that would apply if such an installation were proposed in a residential neighborhood. In terms of siting, oftentimes infill parcels within neighborhoods are being looked at for these types of uses. So something to consider as you're preparing your ordinances. The second trend that we're seeing a fair amount of is that the uses of solar panels on shade structures. And while for the most part this application of solar is fairly straightforward, there are a couple of items to keep in mind. First, a question to ask is whether the panels being proposed are fixed in place or installed on a movable track. Most of the examples you see are an integrated panel, but there are some instances where we're seeing a movable panel on top of a structure, and so there's some different issues to consider. If they are fixed, standard accessory structure requirements will likely work just fine. However, if the panels are designed to track with the sun, the height of the combined structure, so the shade structure as well as the solar energy system on top of it, is going to vary during the day. So at certain points, it may far exceed your standard height limits for the accessory structures. And this also raises some potential concerns for adjacent neighbors in terms of both height and reflectivity. In addition, depending on whether solar is defined as a unique use in your code or is treated as a building appurtenance, additional height questions may come into play. This is definitely something to try to anticipate and address up front as communities work through their development regulations. Lastly, the concept of mandatory solar is something we've seen emerge more recently in some parts of the country. Ann talked about solar-ready requirements, and those have been in place in some states for a number of years. However, the concept of requiring solar in terms of actually installing the solar is something relatively new. Two communities in California initiated this concept over the last year for new residential development and are serving as a model for others who wish to follow. Other communities, such as Culver City, California, have elected to require solar for larger commercial developments, and this is something we're likely going to continue to see in the news over the coming year.
Thanks, Darcy. As we come to the end of our discussion today, I wanted to give you both a chance to offer some final thoughts to help communities integrate solar into their development regulation. Ann, let's start with you.
Thanks, Erin. So to close, I'd like to remind our listeners that whether they are just starting to think about addressing solar in their regulations or if they want to update their existing codes, there are plenty of resources that are available through the Solar Access website as well as through the American Planning Association. We've already mentioned the solar briefing papers that this webinar series is based on. Additional papers that can be helpful in dealing with development regulations can address balancing solar energy with potential competing interests, and also recycling brownfields and other sites for solar energy development. Also, APA's Solar Energy Resource List a frequently asked questions page, and the Planning Advisory Service Essential Info Packet on Planning and Zoning for Solar Energy offer articles, guidebooks, model codes, and sample ordinances on solar energy. APA's Planning Advisory Service will also answer any solar-related inquiries free of charge as part of our participation in the Solar Ops program. Just send your solar planning and zoning questions to pas@planning.org. And finally, a new PAS report, Planning for Solar Energy, is scheduled for publication in January 2014. This will be a comprehensive guide for planners and others on planning and zoning for solar energy.
Thanks, Ann. Darcy, what closing thoughts do you have for our listeners today?
I would just like to encourage our listeners to think comprehensively when considering how to tackle solar in their development regulations. As we've learned today, there is no one right way to tackle this issue, and there are a lot of good examples out there that Ann has touched on, and it's important to understand the range of possibilities, different options to consider, and to develop a tailored approach that best suits your community's needs.
Great. We see a lot of questions starting to roll in, so let's take the remainder of the time that we have today to take some of these questions from our audience. As a reminder, you can submit your questions by clicking on Q&A in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. Let's start with the question for Darcy. Why would a city limit utility-scale solar projects to industrial zones? It seems like they would have little to no use for the amenities in and around industrial areas due to their unmanned facilities having little to no water usage needs, as well as generating little to no traffic impacts.
Well, I think what we're seeing so far is that, it's part of it is a sense of unknown about how these facilities will play out. I think while it has been more traditional in the past for larger facilities to be limited to those districts, it's only been recently that applications for those types of facilities in residential districts have started to emerge. So I think we're seeing a transition in the scale of those facilities, and with that comes an educational process in terms of for neighborhood residents, local communities to sort of start to understand how those smaller solar farm facilities really can be good neighbors within a residential environment.
Okay, great. Thanks.
And also, Erin, let me jump in here.
Sure.
One thing is that there are a couple of benefits that industrial zones offer for locating utility-scale projects. Even though they don't have, they're unmanned, they don't have traffic impacts, a really important need is access to the electrical grid. So a lot of industrial areas were former factories, and so they are already set up for that access. So that precludes developers having to install utility lines out to a greenfield site. In addition, industrial areas are usually already developed. There's often a lot of brownfields, vacant properties after industrial activity has moved out. So these areas are really good places to put utility-scale solar projects for that reason. You're not using greenfield sites. There's little to no surrounding development that might conflict with a utility-scale solar project. So industrial zones can be a good place to have solar projects. Not that you need to limit them there, but that's a good place to start.
Good points. Thanks, Ann. Do either of you guys know, we have a question that's come in about if there's any updated guidance from the FAA regarding solar energy systems near airports following the problems with specifically with the Manchester Airport in Massachusetts.
Yeah, this is Ann. That's not something I'm familiar with. I know that there are a number of solar arrays that have been installed on other airports. Denver, I believe, has a solar array. A number of people worry about glare, but the fact that they have been able to co-locate arrays with airports suggests that there is a way to work around this.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, we've got another question that's come in. What type of noise do utility-grade systems make? The comment is that the Utah ordinance that you referenced, Ann, it seemed to allow for a relatively high noise limits. This person was wondering if there were any complaints as a result of those levels.
Yeah, well, including noise in a solar energy ordinance is not very common. Utah is kind of an example of everything you can think of that might need to be addressed. They've included it, so it's a good comprehensive listing. But one source of noise can be the electrical generating units that are on site, because solar power plants are utility use. They usually include larger utility installations, and so the equipment there can make a noise, and this is probably what's being considered when they're talking about this. Darcy, do you have any experience with this?
You know, the only thing I would add on that, Anne, is that the Iron County example specifically relates to the systems are located in fairly remote areas and a lot of times on public land. So while the noise levels may seem high for, you know, a developed area, I think that's part of the context for that particular example.
Okay, it looks like the next question we have is from someone who has an issue specifically in California, so I'm not sure if either of you will know the answer offhand, but we'll put it out there and see what you guys think. But this person wrote in that they're working with a developer on a large shopping center that supports solar, and it will include for powering all of the common areas. However, I guess the developer is saying that in order to distribute rooftop solar to tenant spaces requires him to act as a utility company and subjects him to difficult PUC regulations. I guess he was asking if any you have had any experience with any issues along these lines.
Not something I've had any experience with. How about you, Anne?
Yeah, it's not something we've directly addressed. It is an issue. And we understand that there's a lot of ongoing discussion in utility regulation circles about this. This would actually be a great question to submit to the Solar Ops website. As part of that website, there's a portal that users can submit any solar-related questions, and those questions will be routed to the appropriate Solar Ops program partner to answer. So there are definitely folks within the Solar Ops program that will be able to shed light on this question.
All right, thanks, guys. And I think you can both probably offer some insight into the next question. Someone was just looking for a little bit more information on the types of uses and terms that should be defined in the development regulations. Can you guys offer any insight into that?
I'd be happy to jump in on that one, Anne. You know, I think one of the things we often find in looking at a code that hasn't really addressed the concept of solar is just some of the basic terminology surrounding the installation of a solar energy system. And, you know, oftentimes different communities will define solar in different ways, so different types of technologies. But I think making sure that you have clearly defined the different types of solar energy systems that we've talked about today, you know, the different scales, different contexts that are relevant in your community are probably some of the most important things to consider. That way, when a project comes forward, you know, you've got a clear place to refer to in terms of how it fits into your code.
Okay, great. And did you have anything to add, or do you think that about covers it?
Yeah, well, I'm taking a look at the essential info packet on planning and zoning for solar energy, which includes collections of sample ordinances. This is available online. And some of the definitions that have been included in some of these ordinances, some communities distinguish between active solar energy systems and passive solar energy systems. Some communities actually define direct sunlight. Just looking through these, a number of communities will include definitions around solar access. So they'll specifically define solar access space. Other communities will define different pieces of the solar system, so the solar collector versus the solar energy system as a whole. And then solar structure, for example, is another example, and that can encompass the kind of parking lot solar shades that Darcy was talking about earlier. So those are just some examples. Users are welcome to look at the info packet for more examples of sample ordinances that include a wide range of definitions.
Okay, great. And I guess we have another sort of code clarification question. Someone was wondering how to distinguish between solar farms and small solar gardens in the code.
You want me to jump in on that one, Ann?
Sure, Darcy.
Okay. Well, I think there's a couple considerations. I mean, first of all, we've just been talking about definitions and noted that different communities will define different types of systems in their, with a slight variation. So important to consider the types of projects that you're seeing in your particular jurisdiction. But I think scale is another thing that comes to mind to consider in terms of, when you're thinking about where in your community you might want to see or not want to see different types of systems and different scales of systems. That might be something to consider as you're kind of grappling with that distinction between those types of facilities. Ann also talked about a number of the more industrially oriented needs of some of the larger commercial solar energy systems, and that might be another factor to consider in terms of specific needs that go along with that system. Anything you'd add to that, Ann?
No, I think you covered it well, Darcy. Thanks.
Okay, and so we just talked a little bit about smaller solar gardens, and then there's another question that's come in about siting large-scale commercial solar farms. And do you know if there's any special considerations that the people on the call should be considering when drafting regulations related to siting of large-scale commercial solar farms?
Yeah, well, we've talked about this here and there in the session. So the primary use solar can have significant land use impacts due to its size and their industrial nature. And then we talked about industrial districts, but one other issue that is coming up is communities that are allowing them in agricultural districts. This can bring up another value conflict of solar versus productive farmland. And there are some communities, especially in California, that are addressing this. Santa Clara County, for example, it outright prohibits solar farms on designated productive farmland. In agricultural districts, it only allows this use on land that has been designated as poor quality for farming. So that's one way to preserve agricultural farmland and then still allow some space for the solar energy development. So this brings up the corollary. One way to avoid these types of conflict is to avoid greenfield siting of solar farms by using sites like brownfields or obsolete industrial lands or even old landfills. A number of communities have capped their municipal landfills and have used those sites for installing solar farms. So land that is otherwise sitting vacant and might actually already have electrical infrastructure in place to connect to. Solar farms can be a great interim use for vacant infill properties where the market is still too weak to support redevelopment right then, but down the road, communities expect reinvestment in that area. And as we mentioned earlier, we do have a briefing paper that covers that topic, so that can be really helpful for listeners.
Okay, that kind of leads well into this discussion of the conflicts of agricultural lands, kind of leads into our next question, which is about the conflicts that you mentioned earlier in your presentation with trees. And what's a good way to address the conflict between solar and trees in the development regulations?
Yeah, so as we mentioned, both solar energy and the urban forest are important components of a sustainable community. So these can be conflicting values in places. Trees obviously can shade solar energy systems, and then there's been some concern that if you install a solar energy system, that might preclude being able to plant trees in that area because it might be shaded in the future. So it's important for communities to really think about how they want to balance these two values. One regulatory method used by many communities is to address this in solar access regulations. Darcy mentioned this earlier. So you can specify that certain types of vegetation are exempt from restrictions. Ashland, Oregon, for example, exempts any trees that are over 15 feet at the time of the installation of the solar system. So any existing trees are basically grandfathered in, but anyone who wants to plant trees later needs to respect the siting of that solar energy system. Darcy, did you have anything to add?
No, that covers it well. Thanks, Ann.
Darcy, here's a question I think would be suited well for you. It's a question about prohibiting, can a local government prohibit HOAs from banning solar panels?
Well, and that's going to depend. We talked a little bit about some of the state requirements or state laws. So something to consider at the local level and at the state level to make sure you understand what whether the state laws actually allow you to do that. So something to check your state statutes, get familiar with that, and then see what you're allowed to do there locally.
Okay, great, thank you. And let's see, the next question that's come in from the audience is, are there any examples of utility-owned distributed solar in the country?
I believe in California, a number of municipal utilities have created distributed solar programs. Darcy, are you familiar with this?
No, Ann, I'm not.
Okay, I think we've seen examples of regulations in the ordinance that basically enable the local municipality to create a distributed solar program. So California would be a place to look for this.
Okay, and again, that might be another good one to submit to the inquiry service, right, for further research.
Absolutely.
Let's see, the next question that's come in is, should our community put a size limit on accessory solar energy systems to minimize impacts? Was that a good idea?
Yeah, I think in some of the earlier ordinances when this was pretty new, communities might have been concerned about the impacts of accessory systems, so they might have put size limitations either on the capacity of the system or on, say, the percent of the rooftop that solar panels can cover, or just the number of panels altogether. But we found that that's really not necessary. It can actually act as an unnecessary barrier to full solar implementation. Generally, other standards, such as preferred roof placement, required setbacks, and height restrictions, will naturally limit the size of the system to what's appropriate for that site. I'll note that a lot of communities do include a provision that if a proposed solar energy system won't meet the by right standards, owners can seek either a variance or conditional use approval of their system. So that provides extra flexibility that we talked about being important while still maintaining control.
Okay, Darcy, do you think you would be able to speak to anything you know about how communities are addressing new building integrated PV systems in their codes?
You might want to clarify the question, Ann. So new building integrated systems?
Yes.
Oh, systems, I think, that are integrated within the roof
structure. Okay, go ahead.
Right.
So, yeah, so one of the things we're finding certainly is that the technology is changing rapidly. And, you know, I think I'll start, Ann, and if you want to jump in, but I think that, you know, we've certainly come across some of the integrated, you know, there's shingles that have integrated systems and other types of technology, and that the impacts of those tend to be less. But any other thoughts you'd add on that, Ann?
Not really. I think you're right. Obviously the building integrated PV systems are a little less obtrusive. They blend in better, so that might allay community worries about the impacts, the aesthetic impacts of these systems. Even though the basic solar technology is pretty much the same, the manifestations of the technology are constantly changing. So whereas earlier it was panels or nothing, now you do have these different options. So just something for communities to be aware of, maybe check their codes, make sure that their zoning codes do allow for these new types of systems.
And oftentimes that can be something you can address in the definitions. We talked about, you know, what's important to define, and having a little bit of flexibility in there to address changes in technology might be a good way to tackle that.
That's a good point.
Okay, and do you know of any communities out there that require solar installations with new development?
I think this is mostly happening in California. So Lancaster, California, and Sebastopol, as far as I know, do. Darcy, can you speak to this also?
Yeah, those are the two I mentioned that this is really a recent thing over the last year. It was early last spring that Lancaster was the first to adopt those standards, and they've got a fair amount of detail in their regulations. Might be interesting to take a look at if it's something your community's interested in. But you know, defining different ways for a developer to meet those requirements. So you know, I think there were requirements for a certain level of energy to be generated by the system. You could buy into, you know, provide a fee in lieu of option. There were a number of different factors there to consider. But as Ann mentioned, right now it is a very limited trend that we're seeing. It's very new, and you know, so far I think most communities have been hesitant to take that next step and actually start requiring it. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Definitely. Do either of you have any comments on what communities can do with the subdivision ordinance to create opportunities for solar energy use?
Yeah, that's another thing I just briefly touched on in terms of solar access. And a lot of times what communities are starting to do within their subdivision regulations is to require those premier, you know, sort of ideal access on streets, lots, and even on buildings to ensure that the solar access is maximized. So whether or not you're requiring those installations up front, at least you're providing the opportunity for existing residents and future residents to have the option to install those systems. So that may manifest itself in you know, a regulation that requires a certain number of lots in a new subdivision to be oriented to maximize solar. And then the other benefit of orienting streets to maximize solar access, of course, in snowy climates is to that kind of help with snow removal and snow melting because you've got that direct access. So so lot orientation, street orientation, and in some cases building orientation might be things to consider.
Also, when you're talking about those types of things, an added benefit is that not only do the solar siting standards make it easier to have effective active solar energy systems, it also allows for passive solar energy use. And so there are various ways to construct buildings, both materials and orientation, location of windows, that capitalize on natural solar energy so that you can better cool a building in the summer and then, more obviously, better heat a building in the winter. So if your subdivision regulations allow for development that is oriented in that way, any structure that's built has a better chance of being able to use the solar resource, whether people are prepared to spend the capital outlay to invest in a solar energy system, or whether they just want to construct in a way that takes advantage of the natural aspects of that site.
Okay, well, we have time, I think, for one more question. So I think this is from someone who's just thinking about putting together, you know, their first solar access ordinance. They want something simple. They just want some suggestions on what would be the basic provisions that should be in an effective solar access ordinance.
I'm happy to jump in, Ann, and you can add in. I think Ann touched on a couple of things early on. Definitely key to make sure you're clear about where you are allowing solar by right or with a conditional use. So your use table is a good place to start. Definitions, definitely something you want to include regardless of how far you go with it. And then addressing some of the basic barriers that we talked about, you know, looking at your setback requirements, height requirements for building appurtenances, or if you've got that clear definition for those types of facilities, that would be a good place to start. Anything you'd add to that, Ann?
Yeah, so solar easements, even though they're less common, it's a fairly straightforward idea that if you have a solar energy system, you can put in place a protection that will protect your investment and then ensure that that system has access to the solar resource. And in a lot of places, these easements require actually checking in with your adjacent neighbors, and they need to sign off on this. So it's something that communities can work into if people are worried that solar easement regulations might be restricting development rights or might preclude further development later down the line. This idea of checking in with your neighbor, making sure that they agree with what you're doing, and then putting in place this protection that's registered usually with the county in that area. That's a good way to start with the idea of being able to protect the solar resource.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both for a great discussion and also thank the audience for the excellent questions that have been posed today. At this point, we're going to post a brief survey on the screen, and we'd appreciate any feedback that you can provide as it's used to help improve future webinar programming. Thanks to everyone for joining us today, and that concludes our program.